you very much, Angela, and to all of you for being here today, Women in Black, Dr. Kilani, Mr. Hourani. It's fantastic being back in Vienna. I was here 10 years ago. I was reminded by Andrew back there that I knew that it was around that period of time, but I couldn't remember when exactly. And I just remember the city leaving, great impression on me. Then it's a very beautiful place, and people are courteous and all of that. But especially that I come from London, and it was very miserable weather today. So just coming here and seeing the weather in this shade, it was amazing. Let me just tell you very briefly about the background of this book. I studied at the University of Exeter with Professor Ilan Pape at the European Institute for Palestine Studies. My focus was people's history of Palestine in particular. And I'll tell you why I became interested in this subject. It's not, I wasn't shopping for topics, looking for, should I talk about this or talk about that? It's something that came rather organically. I was born and raised in a refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. And that's my book. My father was a freedom fighter. Gaza's Untold Story was the story of my family, and by extension, the story of my people. There is a form in academia, a form of studies that we call positionality. It allows you as a researcher to address an issue in which you are also involved as a character, where you don't need to be detached, you don't need to be disconnected from the subject matter to write about it. If it's anything, we need to apply this form of writing to Palestine more than any other place. Simply because our understanding of Palestine is rather, not you of course, but I'm talking in general, is rather disconnected and detached. The kind of terminology that we use to ascribe to the situation in Palestine goes back to over 100 years actually. The discourse that was created around Palestine is essentially a Zionist discourse, because it was the Zionists in Europe and elsewhere that formulated the early European realization of what is Palestine, who are the Palestinian people, and so forth. And of course, according to them, there was no such thing as Palestine as the Palestinian people. Until this day, in fact, this notion that Palestine, as Golda Meir has said in 1967, I believe, that it's not like we came and we uprooted this group of people who are called the Palestinians. The Palestinians simply did not exist. This notion still exists until today. In fact, it's gaining momentum in American politics right now. The likes of Newt Gingrich, for example, who ran for the ticket of the Republican Party for president, one of his famous statements during the last elections were that the Palestinians are an invented people. This notion of the Palestinians being an invented people is not new, and it's not the invention of Gingrich. It's something that has really persisted in Western perception of Palestine for such a long time, to the point that if you, as a Palestinian, tell an ordinary American, I am from Palestine, he wouldn't know what that means, right? So usually, and we kind of talk about it amongst ourselves as Palestinian Americans, like, what happens when you tell someone from Palestine? They immediately say, Pakistan? You say, no, Palestine. Pakistan, and you just keep going until at the end you say, Palestinian, and it's like, okay. Now, they know Palestine, and they know the Palestinian, but they don't know Palestine. They don't associate the Palestinian with a place called Palestine. And the Palestinian is associated with all sorts of negative understanding and perceptions in American media. It's an image that has been demonized for such a long time, and has been putting us as Palestinians and supporters of Palestinians and Arabs and so forth on the defensive constantly. In other words, we always have to vouch for our own humanity. We always have to kind of define ourselves by negation. Palestinians are terrorists, they say. We say Palestinians are not terrorists. Israel doesn't have a partner in peace. We would say, no, actually, we are. We have always sought peace. It's just Israel that has been building settlements and so forth and so on. The constant imagery of the Palestinian is always infused to be a negative imagery. If you look at the way that the Palestinian protests around the Gaza border right now is concerned, you would believe that it's actually quite a negative perception, but it's really unbelievable how even a positive, popular mobilization of this nature can actually be twisted to mean everything vile and evil. The Israelis are defending themselves. It's clashes at best. They want to be fair, balanced, clashes. You have tens of thousands of people who have been living under a perpetual siege. And I always argue that the siege on Gaza did not start in 2007. There's always been a siege on Gaza. You know, those of you who've been to Gaza and understand Gaza's centrality in Palestinian history, Gaza has always been under siege. What do you call the Israeli military occupation, active Israeli military occupation of Gaza, when the Israeli military was inside Gaza for all of these years? Wasn't that a form of siege on Gaza? Of course that was a siege on Gaza. And even when Israel supposedly left Gaza, redeployed out of Gaza in 2005, they kept Gaza completely sealed from sea and water and land. What do you call that? That was a siege on Gaza. But the reason that we always associate the siege of Gaza with Hamas, with 2007 in particular, because it's important for the media to create that negative or to create that balanced view of why there has been a siege on Gaza. The siege on Gaza in 2007, that's when Palestinians elected Hamas. And then again we go on the defensive. But we didn't all elect Hamas. We are not all terrorists, and so forth, and so on, and so forth, and so on. Just the same old game. But if you actually argue that since 1948, Gaza has been under some form of siege, that doesn't really win you a great deal of appreciation in the media, and nobody wants to entertain that argument. So it's important that whatever view we have of Gaza and of Palestine and the Palestinians, it always has to be wrapped around a negative notion. And this is why I say that the narrative is essentially Zionist, in the sense that when the Arab intellectual, when the Palestinian intellectual, when the pro-Palestine intellectual arrived to the scene, it was kind of a case of too little, too late type of situation. Because for decades, the image of the Palestinian was made and distorted repeatedly before we arrived, trying to kind of beautify that image or present it in a way that is maybe malleable and understandable. And that's the issue that we've always had to deal with. The Palestinians did not exist until 1948. Prior to 1948, their Nakba, their catastrophe, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948, the Palestinian did not exist. It was a land without people, for a people without land. That notion that started somewhere towards the mid-late 19th century defined the people in that land until 1948. In 48, you had this huge influx of refugees, anywhere between 750,000 to a million. And then suddenly they were a people. So how do you deal with this? We've already decided that this is a land without people. We redefine these people. They became the refugee problem. The term the refugee problem defined the Palestinian people also for so many years until the Israeli occupation of 1967 and the rise of Palestinian freedom fighting and militancy, and that's the image of the Palestinian terrorist, the Palestinian hijacker, the Palestinian militant, and so forth. In other words, since the very, very, very beginning of this so-called conflict, the Palestinian has been distorted, made and remade repeatedly to fit into whatever imagery Israel wants. Now, the compounded problem is that when we arrived as Palestine Solidarity Group, as Palestinian historians and intellectuals and poets and artists, we found ourselves in this disadvantaged situation. Reality is one thing. Our perception of reality is a whole different thing. And the perception of the reality is that Palestinians are all this list of these terrible things. And we had to contend with that. So we spent a great deal of time trying to present ourselves in a positive light. We are in anti-racist, anti-colonial, anti-military occupation movement that is always on the defensive. In the history of any anti-colonial movement, it's the other way around. They are on the offensive. But we are always in the defensive. Because we feel that we've lost the battle of history, the battle of text, the battle of politics, the battle of intellect. And this is why I decided to write this book. And for the record, I wasn't the first Palestinian to think about it. Many other Palestinians have done it. But I don't think it's done enough, and I don't think it's done in an organized, conscious way that would allow us to actually defeat this massive discourse that has been in the making for so many years. Israel, in the eyes of so many Americans, is an emotional issue. It's affiliated with so many things, whether back in history, World War II and the Holocaust, or in recent memory. There's always something positive about it. Even if you watch, say, sitcoms, comedy, television, there's always that funny Israeli. There's always this reference to the Israeli in a certain way that's uplifting. That is not even political. It's even culturally relatable to as far as the American is concerned. The Palestinian doesn't exist in that scene. The Palestinian is not part of the American cultural perspective. We don't exist there. If there is any affiliation with the Palestinian, there is only two Palestinians that exist in the American psyche. The American terrorist, the Palestinian terrorist, and the Palestinian victim. There's nobody else. The angry Palestinian burning Israeli and American flags, or a Palestinian being carried on stretchers, and the Israeli, usually the Israeli spokesperson for the Israeli army, explain that, well, we are the most moral army in the world, and this victim, Hamas, should be blamed for it because it fires rockets at Israel, and no civilized government in the world would allow people to fire rockets on them for no reason, and so forth. And then somehow that victimization is also kind of hidden somewhere. It does not leave the kind of impact that could indeed influence the collective American Western view of the Palestinians. So this is what we have been dealing with. This constant, and by the way, both the terrorist and the victim is dehumanizing. Is dehumanizing. We are not a nation of victims. 70 years later, and here still the kids, the third, fourth generation of Palestinian refugees standing at the border waving their flags, and the Israeli snipers on the other side. Now, this may appear, even if you see it from a sympathetic point of view, may appear as an act of defiance, good enough, but I think it's much more loaded in meaning than that. Because you see, the assumption was that the Palestinians will disappear into the masses of the Middle East and somehow melt into all of these cultures and identities, Muslims, Arabs, and so forth. They will not really formulate a unique identity of their own. This is not my view. That was the early Zionist perception of what is going to happen to the refugees. That didn't happen. Successive wars, sieges, and so forth, a military occupation that extended over 50 years, complete dehumanization of the people, living behind checkpoints, behind walls, imprisoned in their own homes, separated from their schools, separated from their land, separated from their hospitals, from their universities, from their jobs. And then yet, you still have tens of thousands of people from all generations descending on the border waving flags. It's more than an act of defiance. It's a nation that insists insist not just on its rights and on its freedom, but insist not to be forgotten. And that's, in my opinion, one of the biggest battles that Israel is trying to fight and win against the Palestinians, is that the war on the Palestinian identity, the war on the Palestinian culture. And it's important. It's important that we resurrect and redefine the Palestinian, not as a terrorist or a refugee problem or a nation that was invented, but to resurrect the Palestinian within the cultural context of the Palestinian. In other words, quit defining the Palestinian based on Israel's definition of the Palestinian or our counter definition of the Palestinian, and let the Palestinian speak for herself or for himself. Let the Palestinian define the Palestinian. It's important to know that there are 32 young people who were killed at the border with Gaza, between Israel and Gaza, since March 30th. And yes, 2,650 were wounded. But also, they are not all victims. There are tens of thousands of people who are still there. They pitched tents. Some of them are actually getting married there. I don't know if you've seen the pictures, but they are getting married and they are dancing their traditional dances, the debka. They are cooking, and there are even circus clowns entertaining the children. You see, this is so important because it is essentially not just the Palestinian relevance of being a body there to be killed and counted as a death toll. We are more than a death toll. We're more than a shrinking map. All of you, I'm sure, have seen the shrinking map of Palestine throughout the years, and it's all true, and we need to emphasize that. But we are more than that either. Maybe we are a shrinking map, but as a people, we haven't shrunk. We're still there. Recently, in a conference in Istanbul for Palestinians abroad, there was about 5,000 to 6,000 Palestinians who came from all over the world. And we had several interpreters in Spanish, in English, in French, and in Arabic. Because we don't all speak Arabic. We are not all Muslims and we are not all Christians. And we are not all living in Gaza and the West Bank, and we are not all from Area A, Area B, and Area C. These kind of divisions might mean something as far as the Israeli perception of the Palestinian is concerned. But as far as we Palestinians are concerned, we're still a people. Wherever we are, we're still a people. And it's that culture and it's those people that I wanted to write their story. My idea behind writing the book is, what if we allow ordinary Palestinians to speak for themselves? Not the factions, not Hamas, and not Fatah. Not the Palestinian the spokesperson for the Palestinian negotiations team. No. The Palestinian, the ordinary Palestinian, in Jabalia, in Nusayrat, in Ain al-Hilwa, in Dahesha, in Ramallah, in Australia, in San Diego, the Palestinian. What makes you who you are? Why the flag means so much to you? The kufiya, your culture, your music. We just lost one of our most beautiful and most important cultural icons. Her name is Reem Benna, if some of you are already familiar with her. Reem is from Nazareth, so she's not technically under occupation. And she's Christian, so she does not fit the stereotype of the Muslim and Christian. But she represented something for all of us, everywhere in the world. Her lyrics, her poetry of Mahmoud Darwish and Tawfiq Ziyadi, and so forth and so on. So we live as a culture, as a people, almost in our own realm, and we invite you to come along, to come and understand this better, to join us. Learn about our authors and musicians and artists. Learn about us outside the confines and the perceptions of the media, or even our own ideological and humanitarian perceptions of Palestine and the Palestinians. It is so important that you do so, because this is not going to be a fight that will end anytime soon. It's a long, protracted fight. And it's the fight that requires real and serious solidarity, sustainable solidarity that's going to last for many years. You see. So this is what we did. we were a group of Palestinian researchers, and I intentionally wanted nobody but Palestinians to be involved in that project, not for any ethnocentric reasons whatsoever, but because I wanted the conversation with the dozens, nearly 200 Palestinians that we spoke with, to be a comfortable conversation, not sound bites. I'm not going to parade you as a victim. What happened when the Israeli army came on that specific day, and did they beat up your son? What happened to your husband when he said such and such to the soldiers? No. We're not Amnesty International, and we are not looking for specific quotes just to create a story that once more celebrate the victimization of the Palestinians. No, we want people to express who they are in their own cultural context. It is something I started in 2002 when my book Searching Jenin. I received a lot of help from Professor Noam Chomsky at the time, and it was a book that I attempted to tell the story of the Israeli massacre in Jenin in 2002, but again from the point of view of ordinary people. You see, and it was a very interesting experience, by the way, because once you liberate people from the confines of politics and you allow them to speak freely, sometimes they end up taking you in every possible direction. And you have to be very patient and you have to be understanding, because you are trying to locate that individual you are talking to within a complex cultural context. So when I spoke with Adil, for example, and I asked her about what happened in April 2002, Adil, she was wounded, and she was one of the few wounded who were allowed to leave the West Bank. And I met her at the hospital, King Hussein Hospital in Amman, Jordan. And I said, describe to me your neighborhood, Adil. And she tried to do so. But then her sense of directions is not at all what I expected. East, west, and that sort of thing, so I can follow that on a map. She understands her map based on the people, that her neighbors, her family, the people she cares about. See? So she would say, well, the army came from near Abu Abdullah's house. Where's Abu Abdullah's house? I don't know. Can you help me, please? She says, Abu Abdullah. You don't know Abu Abdullah? I've never been to Jenin at that time. And then she said, well, you see, Abu Abdullah, his son Abdullah, went to Saudi Arabia. And he came back with a lot of money. And he married this beautiful girl from Qalqilia. And I'm just sitting there, and why did I even ask that question? I could have found it on my own. But you see, the idea is, Adil needed to see herself as someone who doesn't fit cliches and stereotypes. And I'm not going to ask Adil, where did the Israeli army hit you? Where were you injured? And that's it, thank you, Adil, and I move to the second victim. I want to see Adil, and I want her to also see herself as someone who matters beyond these kind of things. And I evolved with that concept until I did my PhD on the subject, and I did this book, The Lost Earth. We spoke to so many Palestinians, and I felt so bad because there's so many Palestinians who wanted to tell their stories, and honestly, I did not even realize that there would be that kind of response, because they are just not used to the idea of their story animating the collective history of the Palestinian people. That's precisely what I wanted to do. So even though the book is made of 8 chapters, in reality, it tells the stories of dozens of people. Although the hero of each story is an individual, in reality the information collected for that chapter comes from all of these other individuals. And so many interesting things I've learned while putting this book together. Number one is that Palestinians don't see their history in the same way that we perceive it, either academically or politically, or even in our solidarity perception of the Palestinians. In other words, they don't see themselves as the Palestinians or Palestine pre-1948 and post-1948. Pre-Nakba, post-Nakba. Pre-1967 and occupation, post-1967 and occupation. They don't. I spoke to Marwan, for example. Marwan al-Assar. Marwan is a lady in her late 70s. I remember her back from the camp. She comes from my refugee camp. She was a very, very strong person, to the degree that she actually organized a group of women who always shadowed the Israeli army every time the Israeli army was in our camp of Nusayrat. Wherever they go, they are following them. Because they know that they are going to be selecting a group of kids. That's during the first Intifada, and what they call the broken bones policy, when they used to break the bones of so many young people. So Marwan would be there, and the moment that a kid is being taken out and selected to be beaten up, Marwan and her friends will charge. Now Marwan is illiterate. Her understanding of politics is really quite limited. I think her understanding of politics is her understanding of her own grief. She lost her son, Kamal, in I think sometime towards the end of the Intifada, and she lost her brother, Kamel, in the brief Israeli invasion of Gaza in 1956. She locates her history based on her son and her brother. That's what her history is. You tell her the difference between this war and that war, she can't tell the difference. It's all about surviving and protecting her family. That's all that matters to Marwan. And of course the solidarity that existed between Marwan and all the neighbors, the women neighbors of Nusayrat refugee camp. Now, this is also interesting, and I don't want to elaborate too much, but I think that particular character was developed because when Israel occupied the Gaza Strip and West Bank in 1967, most of the men went to work in Israel as cheap laborers. The women stayed behind. So they had to do everything. They had to look after their homes, their children. And when the Israeli army started coming to Gaza to break the bones of the kids, they had to also be the protectors of the family. And that's how Marwan became this legendary character in the camp, as she roamed the camp with other women, fighting with the Israeli soldiers and trying to take as much of the beating as possible to prevent the kids from receiving the greater share of the punches and for their bones to be broken. So she has been hospitalized so many times, and she has absolutely no regret, she says. So when I spoke to her about the war, she really couldn't remember it, to the point that I thought maybe Marwan is just not in it anymore. Maybe I need to ask someone. But then when I asked her about her wedding and how she met her husband and her children, she remembers everything in vivid details. When the Israeli army came to arrest my son, Kamal, I'm sorry, her son is Kamal, her brother is Salim. When they came to arrest Kamal, poor thing, he was wearing this and that, and we were sitting to watch that episode, and she has immaculate memory of things that matters to her. Then I thought, she has very good memory, it's not the memory that I perceive to be consistent with how I want her to see things. But who am I to decide and to dictate on Marwan how to see her story? Who am I to dictate on Ahmed al-Hajj, the oldest communist in Gaza? He's in his late 80s now, and he refuses to buy a house. He refuses to buy a house simply because buying a house means he consents to the fact that he is a refugee and he doesn't want to. He belongs in a village called Sawafir that has been occupied and destroyed by Israel in 1948. And that's where he belongs. So in his 80s he refuses to. He believes that every communist in Gaza, everywhere actually, is a pseudo-communist. His generation is the generation of the true communists. And he has his own terminology. He refuses to use the word Nakba. Nakba. What is this Nakba, he says? He said the person who invented the term Nakba was a teacher paid by British schooling. I'm not going to take a term from someone. It's an emasculating term. It's the crime, he says. He emphasizes the term, the crime, repeatedly, to the point I thought, it is the crime. I will not push that term on Ahmed al-Hajj. If he perceives it to be the crime, then it is the crime. So the idea was, how do we create a history that reads in a comprehensive fashion, yet on the other hand, it's a history of individuals. How do we find the overlap? That's the thing, and it's a message I take to many Palestinians, that you think you are divided by geography, by ideology, by politics, but when you share your story, it's essentially the same story. You're all telling me the same story from different perspectives. Your divisions are not as deep as you think they are. You see? So they are all essentially telling you different episodes of the same story. So the book was our attempt at recreating, reanimating Palestinian history, not told from an academic or ideological or any point of view, but the point of view of the people. The hope is this would eventually become the kind of genre that defines Palestinian history and defines the Palestinian people, redefine the Palestinian people in a way that is consistent with the wishes and the political aspirations of the Palestinian people, not our own perception of the Palestinian people. That's the idea. Now, if you don't mind, if I have some time, I'd like to read a few excerpts from the book. Are we doing okay on time, Angela? Yeah. This excerpt is from a chapter called Shit River. And it's the story of a Palestinian refugee from Yarmouk refugee camp in Syria. And the book starts from the very end because I wanted to challenge this perception that our story always goes in that kind of particular order. Nakba, Naksa, First Intifada, Second Intifada, Siege on Gaza, and so forth. No, thank you. It doesn't work that way. The Palestinian is not divided in his mind in that sense. The story is essentially the same story, and in fact, you can pick it at any point in history and tell the story. So I decided to start from the very, very end, in Yarmouk. And it's called Shit River because there is this open sewer somewhere between Serbia and Macedonia, I believe, in which the refugees who ran away from Yarmouk and other parts of Syria had to cross every time they tried to enter Europe illegally. But every time they tried to enter, they were sent back and forth. And every single time they had to go through that shit river and get covered with feces and couldn't shower for weeks and were imprisoned in that way for many days. And he kept telling me that story to the point that I felt like it really defines his own perception of himself and his life during this time in history. So I decided to call it Shit River. Just before he died, Mohammed Abdelghani al-Lubani had transferred the deed of his Yarmouk home to his son's name and also left him with another small plot of land in Al-Mjaddid, the original village in Palestine from which he was expelled before walking to Jobar. The old man, a proud man, who paved roads in Nazareth and scooped cow dung in Syria, also left his family with his most prized possession, a large, old, rusting key that had opened the door to his cherished Palestinian home. The house no longer exists, but the key was kept in the family home in Yarmouk as a testament to their right of return. And now, the Yarmouk home no longer exists either. The legacy of that original refugee who once walked to Jobar with his whole family in one straight line is still fully observed by his grandchildren, all of them. And Khalid Jamal Abdelghani al-Lubani, also known as Marco, is still walking to his next resting place in one straight line. This is an excerpt from the chapter called Abu Sandal, and it's the story of the old communist, Ahmad al-Hajj. It's called Abu Sandal, the one with the slippers, because back in Palestine, in his village of Sawafir, he went to school in which he was the only pupil in school who actually wore shoes. Therefore, he was singled out and was called the one with the shoes, Abu Sandal, and that remains his nickname until today. Ahmed and thousands more stared at each tired soul as they walked past, looking for familiar faces or recognizable gestures as they stood near the border to ascertain who remained alive of his family, friends, and acquaintances. When he was finally able to wrap his arms around his mother and all of his siblings, gratitude rushed through him, especially on learning that his sister Maliha, who was almost killed trying to save the gluttonous cow, was alive and well. Not everyone was that lucky, of course. So many familiar faces were assigned a place in memory, as their journey in this life would end in Al-Fallujah and not in Gaza's refugee camps. Ahmed lost many people dear to him, including his uncle and his family from his father's side, his mother's side, and a teenage Egyptian soldier he had befriended in the early days of the siege. The two friends would talk every night into the early hours of the morning about poetry and an ideal world where all the fallahin of the world were united against imperialism, Zionism, and the feudalistic families that spoke of revolutions but chose to escape before the battles even commenced. These missing faces would haunt Ahmed in the back of his mind, yet many fallahin thought that perhaps there was some mercy in not coming back at all. This excerpt is from a chapter that really wasn't even supposed to be in the book. It's a story of a man by the name of Ali Abu Mughassib. He is a fighter, or he was a fighter with Fatah, including during in Jordan, in Lebanon. He even fought in Iraq in 2003. That kind of puzzled me. He actually took a bus with a group of volunteers and he went to Qasrain, a little village, a little town between the border of Kuwait and Iraq, and he was the first to receive the Americans, and he fought there for months, and eventually he was evacuated out of the country. And he was puzzled by the fact of why. I asked him, why did you even fight in Iraq? It's not your fight. But for him, it was his fight. In fact, when he went back to Gaza, eventually he was in a Syrian jail, he was released, he went back to Gaza without his family. And he went to the border, and he asked the young men at the border if he could join them. At that time he was an old man, and his body was scarred with so many bullets and shrapnels, and he could barely walk. And he said, I told him, so what happened when you went to volunteer to fight with the resistance at the border? He said, well, they said, you fought, and now we continue the fight. So what happened? They bought me a kebab sandwich and they sent me home. Ali lives in a what do you call a caravan, or like a mobile home, no electricity, no running water. A man who fought for decades, and here he is ailing and aging alone. The reason I was talking to Ali is because he doesn't have his family. He got separated from his family in Syria, so the effort was made by few activists in Gaza. If we could write an article about him, or perhaps a letter to the Red Cross, maybe we can unite him with his family. But when I spoke with Ali, his story was so involved and so interesting that I thought it really is a representation of the Palestinian armed struggle experience. And that's why I ended up using it. And it's a letter to his daughter Hiba. It's called Letters to Hiba. Hiba, I tried my hardest to shield you from all harm. You saw me in my heyday as a fighter in my military fatigue, but also as a broken man who worked under the burning sun as a manual laborer. My pocket hid the secret of a fake name on a forged identity card. All the while, I was fighting for you. And I really thought we could win. I long fantasized about our final trip to Palestine, once it would be liberated. I imagined you wearing the thobe I bought you from Burj Al Barajne, embroidered with the colors of the flag. I imagined Ahmed as a fighter too, wearing a khaki outfit, adorned with a black and white kufiya. In that fantasy, I was always old, but strong enough to remember everything clearly. I would guide you through our village in Wadi Shalalha in Deir al-Saba. This is where your grandfather Aish fell in love with your grandmother Hamda, I would say. And he would smile and insist I tell you the story all over again. And you needed to know every detail, from the color of the sky to the flowers that bloomed. He was a poor man too, a Bedouin like me. And like me, he was short, dark, and wrinkled. But unlike me, he had little patience. His life was always hard. And when he was forced out of his village, that small piece of land we called At-Tur al-Abyad, he lost his mind. He lost everything. Two more excerpts. This one is from a chapter called Jesus of Beit Jala. If you are familiar with the geography of the West Bank, Beit Jala is this small, beautiful town that's adjacent to Bethlehem. Sarah's parents were determined that she would grow up to defy that norm by recognizing herself as a Palestinian Arab Christian from Beit Jala. But they could not protect her entirely. Sarah's understanding of herself came into question one day when her second grade teacher, Mrs. Levy, asked her pupils a simple question. Where do your ancestors come from? The exercise was meant to highlight the wonderful fusion of cultures that Australia is supposed to represent. Mrs. Levy had planned to have the children color the flags of the countries that their families had come from and then hang them around the classroom. It was a testament to inclusion and multiculturalism in which Mrs. Levy strongly believed. Yet all of that ended when Sarah declared enthusiastically, I am from Palestine. Sarah did not know that Mrs. Levy was Jewish. Even if she had known, she would not have cared or have even understood the layered meanings of that identity in relation to Sarah's as a Palestinian Arab, and Mrs. Levy, according to some, as her political or her cultural antithesis. Until that moment, grade 2 had been quite an event for her. Sarah had focused hard in school. She was always happy there, away from her stressful home life. Sarah's English skills were constantly improving, and aside from her father's violent temper, things were going quite well for her. But when Mrs. Levy said that there was no such thing as Palestine, and immediately moved on to another student, ignoring Sarah's bewildered expression, something inside the little girl forever changed. It could not be that Iyad had been lying to her all of her life, and that her mother and even Uncle George were part of a conspiracy to convince her that she was something she was not. And for what purpose? Palestine was a fact. She relived the memories of her visit. She had been there. She had smelled the fruit trees and tasted the dry thyme and olive oil and had dipped her falafel into the homemade hummus. She had seen the villages and the welcoming children who spend their entire summer vacations plotting ways to acquire candy, and the kind village elders whose kisses left traces of a unique and ancient scent. Palestinian Jesus may have looked tortured and dazed as portrayed in Beit Jala's many churches, but he was kind. And he said, He said gentle things about the poor. And he called on those who went astray to return to God's kingdom. And the final and very short excerpt. A long time ago,